So let me ask you this straight up. If somebody gets a positive COVID diagnosis, is it a death sentence?
No.
What are the statistics here?
Well over 99% survival.
Hello, everyone. Dr. Chris Martinson here, and welcome to the show. And it's one I've been waiting for. We've all been waiting for. Today, we are talking with Dr. Peter McCullough. Dr. McCullough is an American cardiologist. He's editor-in-chief of the journals Reviews in Cardiovascular Medicine and Cardiorenal Medicine. In addition to being an MD, he holds a master's in public health from the University of Michigan. He's an author on over 1,000 research publications, holds an H-index of anything over 100 is really quite an accomplishment. His is 117. In other words, we are talking today with an exceptionally talented and brilliant cardiologist and a deeply principled man whose entire life and profession has been permanently impacted by what he's learned about COVID and saving patients' lives.
Let's watch.
So you believe this is a premeditated thing that they were doing. So they realized that in order to get people enthusiastic about taking this vaccine, the best way to do that was to not have a protocol for treatment.
It's not just my idea. Now it's completely laid out by the book by Dr. Pam Popper, the book recently published by Peter Breggin, COVID-19 and the Global Predators, We Are the Prey. I wrote one of the introductions. Dr. Leif Leet and Dr. Vladimir Lysenko wrote the other introductions. These books are basically nonfiction. They have 1,000 citations in the Breggin book showing how it was coordinated and planned. Now Bobby Kennedy has his book out, The Real Anthony Fauci. I'm the most mentioned physician in that book. I can tell you that if you want to find the evidence that Moderna was working on the vaccine before the virus ever emanated out of the lab, if you wanted to find the collusions and the operations between the Gates Foundation and Gavi and CEPI and Pfizer and Moderna and the vaccine manufacturers and the Wuhan lab and the National Institutes of Health and Ralph Barrick and University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and how all this was organized, if you want to see the Johns Hopkins planning seminar called the SPARS pandemic in 2017, where they had a symposium, people showed up, they wrote up their symposium findings, they published this. It says it's going to be a coronavirus. It's going to be related to MERS and SARS. It's going to come over here to the United States. It's going to shut down cities and frighten people. There's going to be confusion regarding a drug, hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, and we're going to utilize all that in order to railroad the population into mass vaccination. It's laid out in the Johns Hopkins SPARS pandemic training seminar. The only thing that got wrong was the year. They said it was going to be 2025. Instead, it landed a few years early.
Peter, welcome to the program. It's been long overdue. I'm so glad to have you on.
Chris, it's a deep honor to join your program. I've been following you the entire time through the pandemic, learning from you, as so many doctors have across the world.
Oh, me teaching you? That seems impossible, but I've learned that I'm a guy with a lot of time on his hands. So I just love researching stuff and figuring out how to communicate it. And as you know, that passion has gotten me in trouble. And that's what we need to talk about today. It was January 23rd, 2020, I put out my first alert that something was coming. And that was just based on watching China, put a ring fence around Wuhan and shut it down. I know the Chinese don't do these things lightly. So I started talking about it on February 5th. My wiki page, which had been up for 12 years, I was taken down for being a non-notable person. And it was abolished because apparently I ran afoul of something. So my question to you starts here. How concerned were you about COVID right at the outset? And how long did it take you to realize that our response to it as a country was maybe not ideal?
Chris, I did not have your prescience at all. I was caught by surprise. I heard about, a few individuals in China getting ill in January. I didn't think much of it. China had other types of viral infections in these various markets. And we know that SARS-1 came out of China. And I remember telling my colleagues, I said, I think this is going to be the biggest blowover, this biggest scare that turns out to be basically not important to populations, or it's going to be Armageddon. And I couldn't tell which one, and things moved into March. And it was around March or so, we started closing things down. I was the director of a training program. We started to figure out how to manage the trainees. And through March, what happened is myself and actually our chief of cardiology, we decided to honestly really take matters into our own hands. We applied for an FDA new drug application. We wrote a protocol in order to try to use some drug therapy to prevent COVID-19 in our workers. I was part of the health system task force calls every week. And I can tell you, I think we had gotten into April. And one time on these calls, Chris, I asked the question, are we going to start to treat this illness? Or are we just going to let these patients pour into the hospital? And you could hear a pin drop.
So somewhere around April, you realized maybe there were some treatments, and I mean, I'm wondering about your whole wake up process there, because nobody knew what to do at first, and we saw the horrible things coming out of, say, Italy, and then New York City, and people were going onto ventilators and just crashing. But from a clinical standpoint, how long before you realized, hey, maybe there are some things we can do here?
We saw our first case at our medical center, first fatal case. It was a man about my age who flew from New York to Dallas. He pretty much was sick in DFW airport. He was brought to our center, and we watched him after being admitted rapidly go into this multi-organ system failure. And then ultimately we had a series of publications. We had studied how the respiratory failure, it basically at some point in time led to right ventricular collapse, and just basically a form of a pulseless electrical activity cardiac death. We had published a case report of a woman, again, about my age, admitted with COVID-19 and developed a markedly prolonged QT interval in the ICU and had torsade de pointe and required resuscitation. And in fact, that individual, interestingly, received no hydroxychloroquine. It was just, ICU prolonged QT interval that was related to, and we had postulated that was related to interleukin-6, kind of the lead cytokine. But what we had learned in a matter of a few weeks was the following: that the virus seemed to have a prolonged viral replication phase. It basically shaded in a cytokine storm, or a syndrome of inflammation led by interleukin-6, the lead cytokine in this unusual cytokine storm. And that actually shaded into a prothrombotic state, a form of microthrombosis that occurred. And the microthrombosis settled into the lungs and was responsible for the hypoxemia we were seeing. And we were communicating, our teams had divided into these inpatient teams that, ICU, our wards became kind of closed to anybody else. If my patient developed COVID-19, I couldn't see them myself. I couldn't go into the COVID unit, but we were communicating. We had a series of noon conferences, grand rounds, the task force meeting calls. And I was on one call with the NIH, the NIDDK. And I'll never forget, I think hundreds of people were on that call. It was led by Dr. Robbie Starr of the NIDDK at NIH. We were just sharing information. What are you seeing? What are you talking? And when we learned about lines, dialysis lines clotting, we were learning about fatal strokes and these horrific thrombotic deaths. And so we had put it together. The Italian connection was important. I had great collaborations with Italy, and several of my key contacts there were part of the Coracle Research Network. And so we started working with the Coracle investigators to, as rapidly as we could, publish our observations about what was going on.
So somewhere right around there, you're starting to realize maybe there are some treatments. I remember I caught, for whatever reason, I saw very early on Pierre Corey, even before his ivermectin testimony, there was a methylprednisolone or a corticosteroid talk that he gave where he was like, listen, people, we can do something. And it was amazing the amount of pushback he got. And I saw other doctors really piling on, telling him what a horrible person he was for having made that. But he's obviously an ICU intensivist, and he's very, very skilled at watching patient charts. And he explained it to me. Look, Chris, there's trajectories, right? Somebody's on a trajectory, and you can see it. Their oxygen sats are doing this, their heart rate's doing that, their blood pressure, whatever. They have a trajectory, and then you give something and it goes the other way. That's all the information he needs to know that he's doing something that's working or doing something that's not working, is the trajectory. He said it was completely obvious, but Peter, I was astonished at how long it took for the medical system in the midst of a pandemic, when we're supposed to be throwing all of our best and brightest at this thing, how long it took for that clinical insight to penetrate. And it took a big RCT coming out of the UK when they went with dexamethasone, 6 milligrams. Pierre's using like 120 of methylprednisolone. Like I watched this and I just couldn't understand how at a moment of severe urgency, why it took so long for even basic insights to somehow come through on the clinical setting. What was happening there?
Well, we had no rapid communication infrastructure. I think our National Institutes of Health honestly could have held virtual Bethesda meetings. As a cardiologist, you and I recall that when there's a question of interest, many times there'll be a meeting in Bethesda, Maryland, and we all come, open meeting, academics, government officials, pharmaceutical device industry, and we actually try to, put our scholarship on a problem and get a solution. Everything was suspended in the pandemic. We were all suddenly in free floating isolation. And it was interesting. So I was working with the Coracle Network completely independently of Pierre Corey and Paul Merrick, who were forming the Frontline Critical Care Consortium that was completely independent of Vladimir Zelenko in Monroe, New York, Yvette Lozano here in Dallas. I didn't even know about what Yvette was doing. We had Brian Tyson and George Freed out in South Central California. We had Didier Riot in Marseille, France. And then we had Dr. Barentios in South America, Dr. Chetty in South Africa. We were all working independently. This is so interesting, Chris. And feverishly looking for any just leads in the literature on where we could go with this. And what I told you in kind of the group that I had formed, our rules were the following. We knew that large randomized trials would take 2 to 4 years. Okay. We knew that was going to be too long. We knew guidelines were going to take a couple of years after large randomized trials. So, guidelines, they were out the window. We weren't going to wait for them. So we actually took what's called the precautionary principle. That is that, this is a mass casualty event. We must do something. If we do nothing, the mass casualties will continue to mount. We must do something. And so we looked for drugs that had a signal of benefit. We knew it was a complicated, at least triphasic illness, and that we would use drug combinations, just like we did pretty early on in HIV. It's been done in hepatitis C. We even do it for complicated bacterial infections. We use multiple drugs. And we look for drugs that would attenuate viral replication, help treat the cytokine storm. You had mentioned steroids, and then manage the thrombosis. And we thought if we could put together a program like that, we had a reasonable chance of reducing hospitalization and death. What we saw in the hospital was really alarming. Patients would come on the mechanical ventilator. They wouldn't come off. I joined the Stop COVID Research Network out of the Brigham and Women's Hospital. So immediately we started getting data, which was wonderful. That was led by David Leaf. I give him a lot of credit for that. And we actually saw ICU mortality even into the pandemic. If someone's sick enough to be in the ICU, the 30-day mortality was like 30%. Some risk groups was even higher. We learned from multiple institutions, Stop COVID, but also Oxford, other groups, that the virus was amenable to risk stratification, meaning that the infection in someone 80 years old was quite different than someone who was 20 years old. And so the principles of risk stratification, those principles of contagion control, the principles of reducing the inoculum, the amount of virus exposed, and then multi-drug treatment, that became the formation of our first paper in the American Journal of Medicine. We had gotten the ideas together through May and June and then finalized things. I had a lot of authors. So we had authors from UCLA, Emory, myself in Dallas, Italians from both Siena as well as from Milan area. It took a lot to coordinate all this. We were going to do New England Journal of Medicine, and we started to see some things we didn't like in the New England Journal of Medicine, as well as Lancet, including fraudulent papers, which we'll get to in a minute. So I said, forget it. I'm going to go to a safe home base, American Journal of Medicine. I talked to Joe Alpert, the editor, about this. We got a very good peer review. We published the paper in American Journal of Medicine. The title of the paper was Pathophysiologic Rationale for the Early Ambulatory Treatment of COVID-19. And that paper rapidly became the most downloaded paper that the American Journal of Medicine had on file. In fact, today, it's still the most downloaded paper for a year, and they publish weekly. So I can tell you this went by storm. And through this process, through the spring, through this whole developmental process, I remember I was called by Peter Navarro from the White House. And Peter said, listen, can you help me out? We've got a hydroxychloroquine supply here. It's being blocked by Rick Bright and some others within the administration. He goes, I need some help. Is there a way we could appeal to the FDA on this emergency use authorization on hydroxychloroquine? And what I had learned is that hydroxychloroquine was a drug, not the only drug, but a drug we had in our treatment protocol. And what the issue was is that there was an emergency use authorization placed on hydroxychloroquine. Now it's already on the market. It doesn't need an EUA. So the EUA was basically a restriction. and it was initially restricted to inpatient use. And then with a fraudulent paper from Lancet, from a company called Surgisphere, and actually some authors from Harvard, that implied hydroxychloroquine did harm in the hospitals, a completely fraudulent paper. The database made no sense. It was people in their 40s. We don't hospitalize people in their 40s. By the way, there was a similar fraudulent paper in the New England Journal of Medicine on ACE inhibitors from the same group. So, the New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet had actually already shown the proclivity to publish fraudulent papers from a fraudulent data source. And I can tell you as an editor, I've been an editor for 20 years, Chris. That has never happened under my watch. So we started to see actually complete failure of the trustability of the medical literature. So we chose American Journal of Medicine. I worked very carefully with the editor. We published this paper, became the most frequently downloaded paper in that journal. I started working with Peter Navarro. I put the letter to try to, we were stuck with the EUA on hydroxychloroquine. I wanted to expand it across the board. That was rejected. The next thing you know, I started working with the Senate, Senator Ron Johnson, and then some associated senators, the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. And then by the fall of 2020, we had an outpatient treatment protocol, peer-reviewed and published. We had a patient guide with that treatment protocol. We are beginning to organize telemedicine networks because doctors that were not jumping into action treating patients. And then we had set up the U.S., now historic U.S. Senate testimonies. I led off the first one on November 19th. I reached out to Pierre Corey and J.J. Roster, and it turned out J.J. Roster had actually had the most experience with ivermectin. We had him lined up for the December 8th Senate testimonies. And these testimonies basically broke the news to America and the world that we could treat COVID-19 with combinations of drugs early. Data came in, it was interesting, from Didier Rialt from France, from Vladimir Zelenko in Monroe, New York, and then Brian Proctor here in Dallas. All three studies showing that early treatment, even our earliest protocols, Chris, were associated with 85% reductions in hospitalization and death compared to fair comparator groups, whether they be representative groups that were not treated or from calculated risks from the Cleveland Clinic calculator, which came on in terms of calculating the risk of hospitalization. There weren't randomized trials, but we didn't have time for randomized trials. And 2 years later, do you know there's not a single large multi-drug randomized clinical trial even planned in COVID-19? And I went on Tucker Carlson earlier this year, and I told him, I said, Tucker, do you know to this day, Harvard doesn't have a protocol? Duke does not have a protocol. Mayo Clinic does not have a protocol. Do you know these iconic institutions don't have a single idea on how to treat COVID-19 at home to prevent hospitalization and death? It is a colossal lapse, a colossal blunder of academic medicine to not apply any intellectual thought or effort into trying to prevent hospitalization and death. It's inexplicable.
Beyond inexplicable. And just to close up that Lancet paper that was a fraud, within 48 hours, I knew that was a fraud. And Peter, this isn't my field. I just looked at it. I'm just a guy, right? And I read a few things on Twitter, and somebody said, hey, does it make sense that this little company, which has 6 people operating out of a storefront in Chicago, would have data feeds to 691 hospitals? Let me explain what a data feed is. So I talked to somebody who is actually in the medical field of saying, oh, no. Every hospital has their own data system, and they don't really talk, and there's a lot of scrubbing. And to even get one data feed to one hospital, all these HIPAA laws and database shielding and then harmonization practices, this looks like $1 million to set up one of these. They claim to have 691 data feeds, including to hospitals all over Africa, where they were getting like really sophisticated heart pulsimetry data out of hospitals that probably didn't even have a machine for that. And I just looked at this with it. I was like, this is a fraud. How do the editors at Lancet not see that if I could?
I looked at it too. And also the timing. They had cases so early in the pandemic. How could they have organized all the data? How could they have gotten IRB approvals and IRB exemptions? How did all this come together? And the mean age was in the 40s. And we were hospitalizing people in their 80s, Chris. I knew in a second it was a fraudulent paper. And I can tell you as an editor, there are multiple reviewers assigned. I've published in Lancet. I've published in New England Journal of Medicine. There's multiple reviewers assigned. There's associate editors. There's editorial meetings, and finally editorial decisions. It's a high bar. It is a high bar. It honestly, Chris, in New England Journal of Medicine, remember the topic there was ACE inhibitors. It was not such a charged topic. The topic in Lancet was hydroxychloroquine. It looked like there was a breakdown. It looked like it was actually intentional.
Yeah. All right. So let me ask you this straight up. If somebody gets a positive COVID diagnosis, is it a death sentence?
No.
What are the statistics here?
Well over 99% survival, which is absolutely wonderful. It means that, Chris, the most important thing is this is amenable to risk stratification. It was the very first thing I put in my paper, and it's been shown now by multiple studies. We don't need to treat everybody. The estimates are about 25% of adults have enough risk to be treated. And what I mean by that is age over 50, start adding comorbidities like obesity, diabetes, heart and lung disease, kidney disease, prior cancer. We can actually get to an over 1% risk for the composite variable of hospitalization and death. And what we said is, listen, over 1%, that's enough to actually move the needle, and let's do something. Now, clearly we can get to, if we got to somebody in their 80s and they had heart failure and chronic leukemia and lung disease, we can get to risks of 40 and 50 and 60% in an individual of death. And what we know, our CDC has told us that the majority of people have actually died of COVID-19. About 90% actually have conditions that were also, in a sense, comorbid or co-fatal conditions. A great example is recently Colin Powell died, our former Secretary of State. He had kind of a very advanced multiple myeloma. He had taken the vaccines. The vaccines had failed. And in the end, he's in his 80s and he dies of COVID. And he could have died of myeloma later in the year. This would characterize about 90% of the COVID deaths in the United States, just like Colin Powell, whether vaccinated or not. And then also recently, Italy has just reclassified all their deaths. The number they came up with is 97% of deaths. So what people have been keyed in on is younger people who have died, which is very rare, but they die dramatic deaths and they don't have other comorbidities. And then people start to, in a sense, develop a conceptual fear of COVID-19 that, wow, I could be that next very rare case.
Hey, everybody out here in what we call public land. This is where we're going to have to end this interview right now, because Peter and I are going to talk about some things that maybe we know are a little bit sensitive. So if you want to see part 2 of this, if you want to find out what we're going to continue this conversation about, which, by the way, is really important information, come on by peakprosperity.com, and that's where you'll find the rest of this interview. I would love to be able to offer it to you here out in public, but we still live in a land of censorship and a place where data can't be freely discussed by 2 doctors without running afoul of whatever the censorship machine is. So that's all we have for you today here. And if you want to see part 2, come on by Peak Prosperity. Until next time, I'm Dr. Chris Martinson.